Star Wars is a failing brand. This statement seems confusing at first, because we remember how powerful it used to be. The financial numbers from the past are indeed very large. The movies have earned billions and billions of dollars over many years. When Disney bought Lucasfilm, they paid $4 billion. They made that money back very quickly from box office returns and merchandise. This is the story of success that Disney likes to tell. It is a surface-level truth, and it hides a much deeper problem. The reality is that Star Wars is now creatively bankrupt. The company has no compelling new stories to tell that excite the entire fan base. The most obvious proof of this failure is the long theatrical drought. The last movie was released in 2019, and there will not be another one until at least 2026. This 6-year gap is not a planned break. It is a full retreat from the big screen. It signals that the company is lost and has no clear vision for what to do next. They are afraid of failure, so they have stopped trying. The core problem is a misunderstanding of what makes a brand healthy. Making money in the short term is not the same as building a franchise that people will love for generations. A brand can be slowly dying while it still makes money from its past successes. Star Wars is in this exact position right now. The fan base is not united. It is deeply fractured and often angry. People argue constantly about the quality of the new stories. Merchandise sales, which are a key indicator of a brand's health, are in a serious decline. Toy companies are reporting much lower sales for Star Wars products. The new television shows on Disney Plus start with some interest, but then they consistently lose viewers every week. The initial excitement from The Mandalorian has completely disappeared. It has been replaced by widespread audience fatigue and disappointment. The brand is being managed for quick profits, with little care for its long-term survival. This is a recipe for irreversible decline. This analysis will show in great detail that Lucasfilm is a broken company. Its leadership has failed to provide a clear direction. The stories it tells are a messy and contradictory web. Its production model is dysfunctional, leading to countless cancelled projects. This analysis will prove that the failure is comprehensive. It is not just one bad movie or one unpopular show. The failure affects every part of the franchise, from films to toys to fan loyalty. This essay will then propose a series of necessary fixes. These are not small suggestions or gentle advice. They are radical changes that are required to save the brand from collapse. The first solution is a complete change of the leadership at the top. The second solution is a fundamental restructuring of the story universe, which may include erasing certain parts of it. The third solution is a total reinvention of how they create films and television shows. The final and most drastic solution is for Disney to sell Lucasfilm to a new owner. The current path is not sustainable. It leads only to more brand dilution and cultural irrelevance. Only a major, immediate transformation has any chance of saving the Star Wars galaxy from its current management. The stakes could not be higher for one of the most important stories ever told. The foundation of Star Wars, built by George Lucas, is both a gift and a prison. The original trilogy established a nearly perfect narrative structure. It was a classic hero's journey, set against a clear backdrop of good versus evil in a galactic civil war. The Force was a simple, mystical energy field. Its rules were vague and all the more powerful for it. This narrative simplicity was the core of its massive appeal. Then Lucas created the prequel trilogy. This second act was fundamentally different in tone and execution. It was a complex political tragedy, charting the fall of a democracy through manipulation and war. It depicted the Jedi Order not as flawless heroes, but as a rigid, arrogant institution blind to its own failings. This expansion of the universe was ambitious, but it also created a deep complication. The Star Wars framework was now split. It was both a simple space fairy tale and a dense philosophical drama about power and corruption. Any new creator stepping into this universe must now carry the immense weight of both these conflicting visions. They are forced to serve two different masters, a challenge that has proven time and again to be nearly impossible. The initial decision by Disney to discard George Lucas's own sequel treatments was a catastrophic misstep that continues to haunt the franchise. Lucas's outlines, while certainly unconventional, provided a cohesive vision. He aimed to delve deeper into the microbiological world of the Force, exploring the wills, the fundamental beings that control the universe. His story also centered Leia Organa as the primary political force, struggling to rebuild the Republic from the ashes of the Empire. This was a logical continuation of his prequel themes. Disney, seeking a safer and more familiar path, chose to set these ideas aside. This decision was perceived as a profound betrayal by a significant portion of the fan base. More importantly, it established a terrible precedent for narrative inconsistency from the very beginning of the new era. It demonstrated that the new stewards did not trust the creator's roadmap, yet they failed to replace it with a solid plan of their own. This lack of a guiding vision from day one created the narrative chaos that would define the sequel trilogy and undermine the entire franchise. The psychological burden on modern creatives working at Lucasfilm is immense and ultimately paralyzing. They are tasked with the impossible job of simultaneously honoring a legacy that is over 40 years old, while also innovating for a new generation. This is a direct and unresolvable conflict. To honor the legacy, they must constantly include familiar elements, like legacy characters, iconic starships, and references to past events. This reliance on nostalgia traps them in the past. True innovation, however, requires the freedom to break from that past, to create new myths and new iconography. This tension is visible in every new project. New characters are overshadowed by the ghosts of Luke, Leia, and Vader. New stories are forced to connect back to the Skywalker saga, no matter how far they travel. This environment stifles creativity. Writers and directors become curators of a museum, afraid to touch the old exhibits for fear of breaking them, and unable to install compelling new ones. They are not storytellers, they are custodians. This burden, the weight of a greatness they are not allowed to move beyond, is the primary source of the creative exhaustion we see today. The legacy is not a foundation to build upon. It is a ceiling they cannot break through. The diagnosis is clear. Lucasfilm is suffering from a severe case of creative paralysis, brought on by the conflicting burdens of its own legacy and a lack of coherent leadership. This is not a problem that can be solved with minor adjustments or a single successful television show. The constant cycle of fan disappointment, viewership decline, and narrative misfires confirms that the current model is fundamentally broken. Tinkering at the edges will only lead to further decay. The patient is on life support, and the situation demands radical intervention. To continue on the present course is to accept the slow, managed decline of one of the most valuable storytelling properties in history. This is an unacceptable outcome. Therefore, this analysis will argue that only a profound and systemic overhaul can save Star Wars. This requires confronting the core failures head-on, with solutions that may be uncomfortable, but are absolutely necessary for survival. This video will explore 4 primary areas of intervention, each representing a significant departure from the current Lucasfilm strategy. The first area is a complete overhaul of leadership and executive strategy. The current management, led by Kathleen Kennedy, has proven adept at managing a production slate, but incapable of articulating and maintaining a long-term creative vision. A new type of leader is required, one who functions as a chief storyteller, not just a chief executive. The second area is the resolution of the canonical paralysis that currently strangles new narratives. The franchise is trapped by the contradictory and unpopular events of the sequel trilogy. This requires a bold move, either a full canonical reset, a targeted retcon of specific story elements, or the formal establishment of a multiverse to compartmentalize different timelines. The third area involves reinventing the creative and production methods. The company must abandon its dysfunctional model of hiring and then stifling. The fourth, and most extreme intervention to be considered, is the ultimate divestiture, the sale of Lucasfilm by the Walt Disney Company. While a drastic measure, it must be evaluated as a real possibility if the corporate environment at Disney is itself a primary cause of the creative stagnation. A new owner, with a different corporate culture and a fresh perspective, could provide the clean break the franchise desperately needs. The following sections of this analysis will delve into the granular details of the franchise's failures, from its financial instability and brand erosion to its narrative, dead ends, and production mismanagement. This detailed diagnosis will provide the necessary evidence to support the radical solutions proposed later. The stakes could not be higher. The choice is not between change and no change. The choice is between initiating a controlled, deliberate transformation or allowing the market and audience apathy to force a chaotic and irreversible collapse. Doing nothing is no longer an option. The financial narrative of Disney's Star Wars era is one of steep and alarming decline, masked by the initial euphoria of a revived franchise. A closer look at the box office performance reveals a trajectory from record-breaking success to outright failure. The Force Awakens earned over $2 billion worldwide, a monumental success that tapped into decades of pent-up demand. Rogue One followed with a strong $1 billion-plus performance, proving that standalone stories could work. However, The Last Jedi, while earning a formidable $1.3 billion, represented a significant drop from its predecessor and sparked a cultural rift that would have lasting financial consequences. This damage became fully apparent with the final two films in this initial wave. Solo, a Star Wars story, became the first ever financial bomb for the franchise, losing money theatrically. The Rise of Skywalker barely crossed the $1 billion threshold, a disappointing end to the flagship sequel trilogy, and a clear indicator of diminished audience enthusiasm. The case of Solo, a Star Wars story, is particularly instructive, as its failure was not a random event but a perfect storm of Lucasfilm's mismanagement. The film's collapse can be attributed to three critical errors. First, the well-publicized director troubles where Phil Lord and Christopher Miller were fired late in production for tonal disagreements signaled a chaotic and indecisive studio. This was followed by the extensive and expensive reshoots with Ron Howard. Second, the film was released a mere 5 months after The Last Jedi, a film that had deeply divided the core fan base. This scheduling demonstrated a profound ignorance of audience fatigue and sentiment. Third, and most importantly, the backlash to The Last Jedi directly suppressed turnout for Solo. A significant portion of the fan base, feeling alienated, simply stayed home. This was not just a failure of one film, but a failure of overarching brand strategy. A comparative analysis of the box office and critical reception data reveals a telling pattern. The films beloved by critics and audiences, The Force Awakens and Rogue One, achieved the highest financial returns, consistently crossing the billion-dollar mark with ease. In contrast, the films that were most polarizing, scoring between 50 and 60% on Rotten Tomatoes, like The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker, saw markedly lower average returns and a clear downward trend. This correlation is undeniable. When the brand delivers a cohesive and satisfying narrative experience, it prints money. When it delivers divisive and inconsistent stories, it drives audiences away and shrinks the box office ceiling. The sequel trilogy did not maintain its audience, it bled it. The financial data proves that the health of the brand and the performance at the box office are directly linked, and that link has been severely damaged. The strategic pivot to Disney Plus was a direct response to the theatrical struggles, but it has created a new and perhaps more insidious problem: the severe oversaturation of content. The sheer volume of Star Wars material now available on the platform is staggering, and it has fundamentally changed the brand's identity. There are now over 254 hours of Star Wars content available for streaming. This includes the new television series, the animated shows, and the entire library of legacy films. However, the theatrical films themselves represent only a small fraction, roughly 12% of this total library. The overwhelming majority of new Star Wars storytelling is now happening exclusively on the small screen. This shift has had a profound impact. Star Wars is no longer a special, prestigious cinematic event that families anticipate for years. It has become a weekly television serial, something that arrives with predictable regularity. This constant churn of content has devalued the specialness of the galaxy far, far away, turning it into just another show in an endlessly crowded streaming menu. The magic is gone, replaced by the mundane rhythm of a content schedule. The viewership trends for these live-action series paint a clear and troubling picture of steep and consistent decline. The Mandalorian Season 1 was a legitimate cultural phenomenon. It was a fresh concept, with a compelling, mysterious protagonist, and it arrived at the perfect time with the launch of Disney+. It drove millions of subscriptions and captured the public's imagination in a way nothing had since the original films. However, this peak was not sustained. It was an anomaly. Each subsequent live-action series has experienced a significant drop in viewership from that high point. The Book of Boba Fett failed to capture the same magic, with reported viewership dropping 30 to 50% from The Mandalorian's highs. Obi-Wan Kenobi, despite the immense popularity and nostalgia for its lead characters, also saw a steep decline in engagement over its season. The pattern is undeniable and worsening. The audience is shrinking with each new show. The initial curiosity that greeted the streaming era has been replaced by widespread apathy, as viewers become more selective or simply fatigued with the constant, overwhelming output. A closer examination of the weekly viewership data for individual series reveals an even more damning internal problem: catastrophic audience retention rates. It has become a consistent and embarrassing pattern for Disney+ Star Wars shows to premiere with strong, even impressive viewership numbers, only to see a massive plunge in audience by the time the series finale airs. This indicates a fundamental failure in the quality of storytelling and pacing. Viewers are intrigued by the premise and the massive marketing campaigns, but they become disengaged by the slow pacing, the mediocre writing, or the frustrating narrative choices as the season progresses. They start the journey with hope, but do not finish it out of boredom or disappointment. This is not the sign of a healthy, engaged, and loyal audience. It is the sign of an audience that is consistently being let down by the product. The streaming strategy, originally intended to build a reliable and perpetual content engine, has instead dramatically accelerated brand fatigue. By flooding the market with a mediocre and overly familiar product, Lucasfilm has inadvertently taught a generation of viewers that Star Wars is no longer must-see television. The severe diminishing returns are a direct and undeniable result of a short-sighted quantity over quality approach that has backfired spectacularly. The health of the Star Wars brand can no longer be measured in box office totals alone, but in the complex and often toxic climate of its own fandom. For decades, the primary schism was between the original trilogy purists and the prequel trilogy loyalists. These two groups debated the merits of simple heroism versus complex political tragedy, and their arguments defined fan culture for years. The Disney era, specifically the release of the sequel trilogy, fundamentally rewrote these battle lines. The new films proved to be a unifying force, but not in a positive way. The sequels managed to accomplish what once seemed impossible. They brought the warring prequel and original trilogy factions together. Both groups found a common enemy in the narrative choices, character arcs, and perceived disrespect for legacy established in the new films. This created a new, larger coalition of disaffected fans, united in their criticism of the current direction of the franchise. While internal squabbles still exist, this shared disapproval of the modern era has become the dominant and most vocal sentiment within a significant portion of the fan base. This unification of discontent has been worsened by a fundamental disconnect between the storytellers and the audience, leading to a breakdown in communication and goodwill. When criticisms of new projects arise, they often focus on narrative elements like pacing, character motivation, and logical consistency within the established universe. However, the studio's response has frequently been to dismiss this feedback as coming from a toxic mind. This pattern of insulating the creative process from all critique, including legitimate and thoughtful analysis, has created a deep rift. The large coalition of critical fans feels their investment and passion are being ignored, or worse, scorned by the very company that relies on their support. This breeds deep resentment and cynicism, ensuring that each new project is met with a preemptive wave of skepticism rather than excitement. The relationship has become adversarial, with the studio and a massive segment of its core audience seemingly at odds. This breakdown in trust is incredibly damaging, as it erodes the foundational goodwill that allows a franchise to weather occasional missteps. That goodwill has been nearly depleted. The most concrete and alarming evidence of this brand decay, however, comes from the stark numbers in merchandise sales. The toy aisle has long been the canary in the coal mine for the health of a children's franchise, and that canary is sending a clear distress signal. Hasbro, a primary toy partner for Star Wars, has reported consistent and severe declines in its partner brands category, which is led by the Star Wars license. In one recent financial quarter, this segment was down a staggering 17%. This is not a minor fluctuation or a simple market correction. This is a crash. It indicates a catastrophic lack of excitement for the new characters, stories, and eras being presented. Children are not asking for action figures from the sequel trilogy's heroes in the same way they did for the original heroes. They are not clamoring for toys from the newest streaming shows. The characters from the Disney era have largely failed to capture the imagination of a new generation in the way that Luke, Vader, and even the prequel characters did. When the toys stop selling, it proves the franchise is losing its cultural relevance and its grip on the future. The merchandise meltdown is the final, undeniable proof that the brand is in a state of severe crisis. The creative failings of the sequel trilogy are not a thing of the past. They are an active, ongoing poison infecting the entire future of the Star Wars narrative. The most critical of these failings was the complete and utter lack of a cohesive, pre-planned roadmap for its central story. Each film was a reaction to the one before it, leading to a schizophrenic narrative that contradicted its own themes and character arcs. The Force Awakens was a safe, nostalgic retread of A New Hope. The Last Jedi aggressively deconstructed those nostalgic elements, aiming for subversion without a plan for the conclusion. The Rise of Skywalker then panicked, desperately trying to course-correct by resurrecting a long-dead villain and retconning major revelations, resulting in a messy, unsatisfying finale. This trilogy did not build to a climax. It stumbled into a narrative dead end, sacrificing coherent world-building and character development for short-term surprises and a rushed, illogical conclusion. The current Lucasfilm strategy to continue the primary theatrical timeline after this disaster is a catastrophic error in judgment. The announcement of a new film centered on Rey Skywalker, set 15 years after the rise of Skywalker, confirms that the studio is trapped in the shadow of its own worst creation. This all roads lead to Rey approach is a creative prison. It forces the entire future of the galaxy to be defined by the consequences of the sequel trilogy, the most divisive and poorly constructed era in the franchise's history. The narrative potential of the New Republic, the Jedi Order, and the state of the galaxy is now permanently constrained by the events of those three films. Any story set after Episode 9 must account for the fact that the New Republic was destroyed off-screen, that the Jedi were once again nearly exterminated, and that the ultimate villain was a returned Emperor Palpatine. This is not a fertile ground for new stories. It is a narrative wasteland. By choosing to double down on this era, Lucasfilm is guaranteeing continued fan discord and limited box office potential. A significant portion of the audience has already rejected the foundation upon which this new story will be built. They have no investment in Rey's new Jedi Order because they saw the collapse of Luke's, a story that deeply upset many. They have no interest in the political state of the galaxy because the sequels rendered the victory of the original trilogy meaningless. Forcing audiences to return to this timeline is like asking them to rebuild a house on a cracked and unstable foundation. The resentment towards the sequels will inevitably bleed into any project connected to them. This strategy fails to move past the most divisive era. Instead, it chains the future to it, ensuring that the shadow of the sequel trilogy will continue to darken the prospects of the Star Wars franchise for years to come, alienating a large segment of its core audience in the process. A fundamental principle of compelling storytelling is consequence. Actions must have weight, and danger must feel real for an audience to remain invested. The modern Star Wars universe has systematically dismantled this principle, creating a narrative environment where no stakes feel permanent and no death seems final. This trend, which we can call survival syndrome, has cheapened the emotional core of the entire saga. The most egregious example is, of course, the return of Emperor Palpatine in The Rise of Skywalker. His resurrection, explained away with a single mocking line of dialogue, fundamentally broke the Star Wars story. It retroactively invalidated the central heroic act of the original 6 films, Anakin Skywalker's sacrifice. The Chosen One brought balance to the Force by destroying the Sith, only for the ultimate Sith Lord to return through a contrived plot device, rendering the entire Skywalker bloodline's struggle and ultimate redemption utterly meaningless. The emotional payoff of 6 films was casually discarded for a cheap nostalgia pop. This virus of survival has infected every level of the franchise, far beyond the Emperor. The list of characters who have survived seemingly certain, often fatal situations is long and damaging. In the sequel trilogy, Kylo Ren survives a TIE fighter explosion and a stab in the stomach. In the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, the Grand Inquisitor is run through with a lightsaber, only to return later, completely fine. In the same series, Reva Savander is stabbed not once, but twice, and survives both times through sheer narrative convenience. In the Ahsoka series, Sabine Wren, a character with no established Force sensitivity, is impaled by a lightsaber and is walking around hours later. This pattern turns the galaxy into a creatively safe space where no one of consequence is ever truly in danger. The audience learns that lightsabers, the iconic weapons of the franchise, are no longer instruments of definitive conflict, but merely dramatic props. The threat is an illusion. This avoidance of permanent consequence fundamentally weakens the emotional power of Star Wars, which is at its heart a tragedy. The prequels are the story of a democracy falling and a hero turning to evil. The original trilogy is built on the foundational tragedy of Alderaan's destruction and the loss of Obi-Wan. These moments hurt, and that pain gives the victories meaning. By refusing to let characters die or suffer lasting consequences, the storytellers are robbing the narrative of its gravity. There are no real sacrifices, only temporary setbacks. This makes the universe feel small and safe, a playground where the good guys might get bruised but will never truly be broken. It is a betrayal of the very essence of the saga. When Darth Vader threw the Emperor down that shaft, it mattered. Now nothing seems to matter at all. The audience's emotional investment dwindles because they know, no matter how dire the situation appears, the story lacks the courage to follow through. The release of The Acolyte was not just another divisive moment for Star Wars. It was a catastrophic demonstration of poor storytelling, blatant disregard for established lore, and a studio's contempt for its own audience. The show genuinely failed on a fundamental creative level. The writing was weak, filled with wooden dialogue and characters who made illogical decisions. The plot was a mess, relying on a confusing twin connection and a poorly explained vergence in the Force to drive its mystery. The pacing was sluggish, with entire episodes dedicated to filler that advanced nothing. From a technical and narrative standpoint, The Acolyte was simply a bad television show, and the audience immediately recognized it as such. The most egregious creative failure was the show's blatant retconning of established Star Wars history, specifically the nature of the Jedi Order a century before the prequels. The show presented a Jedi Order that was dogmatic, arrogant, and secretive, willing to murder children to cover up its mistakes. This directly contradicts the established lore of this specific era, which was meant to be the height of the Jedi as noble guardians of the Republic. The introduction of the concept that a pair of non-Sith, non-Jedi Force users could spontaneously create a powerful Sith Lord like Darth Plagueis' master through their emotions was a profound violation of the existing rules of the Force and the Sith. It did not feel like When fans voiced their legitimate criticisms of the show's terrible writing and destructive retcons, the response from the creators and cast was not to engage with the points. Instead, they launched a campaign of public shaming. They labeled the entire critical audience as racists, bigots, and homophobes. They used the reprehensible actions of a tiny, fringe minority online to tarnish every single person who pointed out the show's objective flaws. This was not a defense of artistic vision. It was a strategic weaponization of social issues to insulate a bad product from any and all criticism. By calling fans names, they attempted to invalidate all dissent without having to address the terrible pacing, the awful dialogue, or the destructive story choices. This tactic exposed a deep-seated arrogance and a profound contempt for the very people who sustain the franchise. The Acolyte fiasco proved that Lucasfilm is no longer interested in telling good stories within a beloved universe. It is more interested in lecturing its audience and calling them bigots when they point out that the story is bad. This has irrevocably shattered the trust between the studio and the fans. An amazing way to push away fans. The high cost of executive meddling at Lucasfilm is best understood by examining the superior sequel concepts that were discarded. The first and most foundational was George Lucas's own vision for the sequel trilogy. His treatments, which were part of the sale to Disney, offered a cohesive, if unusual, path forward. Lucas's story moved beyond the Rebels versus Empire dynamic. It focused on the Wills, the microscopic symbiotic beings that control the universe and communicate with the midichlorians. This was a logical next step from his prequel-era mythology, delving deeper into the scientific and spiritual essence of the Force. Furthermore, his story gave Leia Organa a central role as the primary political leader, working to rebuild the Republic from the ashes of the Empire, a fitting arc for the character. Disney's decision to discard this plan was a catastrophic error. They replaced a singular, focused vision with a committee-driven approach that had no roadmap. They chose nostalgia and market-tested safety over the creative ambition of the franchise's own creator, a decision that set the stage for the narrative chaos that followed. The consequences of this lack of planning became fully apparent with the collapse of the final film. Colin Trevorrow's original script for Episode 9, titled Duel of the Fates, presented a far more coherent and thematically resonant conclusion than what was eventually produced. Trevorrow's script did not bring back Emperor Palpatine. Instead, it focused on the core trio of Rey, Finn, and Poe, giving each a meaningful character arc. Finn would have led a stormtrooper rebellion, a perfect culmination of his journey from First Order soldier to hero. The story pitted Kylo Ren, fully entrenched as the Supreme Leader, against a new, dark side threat from the ancient Sith world of Moraband. The climax would have seen Rey embracing the identity of Rey Solana, a true Jedi who moves beyond the failed dogmas of the old orders. This script represented a thematically rich ending that grappled with the legacy of the Jedi and the Sith, rather than the cheap, nostalgic reset of the rise of Skywalker. The choice to scrap Duel of the Fates in a panicked response to the backlash against The Last Jedi was a fatal strategic blunder. It confirmed that Lucasfilm was reactionary, not visionary. Trevorrow's script, while not perfect, was built on the established threads of the previous two films. It aimed to resolve the New Republic and First Order conflict on its own terms, without the deus ex machina of a returned emperor. By abandoning it for the rise of Skywalker, Lucasfilm demonstrated a profound lack of creative conviction. They prioritized a desperate, short-term course correction over a thematically consistent ending. The decision left the sequel trilogy with a finale that pleased almost no one, retroactively damaged the entire Skywalker saga, and created the narrative dead end that now paralyzes the franchise. The ghost of Duel of the Fates is a constant reminder of a better, more coherent path that was foolishly abandoned. The creative timidity at Lucasfilm extends beyond the sequel trilogy. evident in the fate of several highly anticipated standalone films that were downgraded into conventional television series. The first major casualty was the original vision for an Obi-Wan Kenobi film. This project was initially conceived as a focused, theatrical event, a character study often compared in tone to the film Logan. It was meant to explore the profound guilt and isolation of Obi-Wan during his exile on Tatooine, a dark and introspective story about a broken man haunted by his failures. This powerful premise was sacrificed for the Disney Plus series. The series, by contrast, was forced to stretch a film's worth of story into a bloated runtime, introducing unnecessary action sequences and a contrived plot involving a young Leia Organa. This fundamentally undermined the core concept of exile and solitude. The quiet, psychological Western was replaced by a formulaic adventure, diluting the emotional weight of Obi-Wan's journey to fit the demands of a streaming content calendar. Similarly, the original concept for a Boba Fett film represented a significant creative loss. This project, to be directed by James Mangold, was pitched as a gritty, R-rated or borderline R-rated spaghetti western. It was envisioned as a contained single-planet story focusing on the ruthless and morally ambiguous world of bounty hunting. This promised a tone never before seen in live-action Star Wars, a raw and visceral look at the galaxy's criminal underbelly. Instead, this bold vision was scrapped in favor of the Disney Plus series, The Book of Boba Fett. The series completely abandoned the promised tone. It transformed the feared bounty hunter into a passive, inefficient crime lord who spent too much time in a Bacta tank. The gritty Western was replaced with slow-speed chases and a narrative that undermined the character's established mystique. The loss of Mangold's film meant the loss of a unique genre experiment, another victim of the shift to a safer, more homogenized streaming format. The pattern is clear and damaging. Lucasfilm had opportunities to produce distinct, auteur-driven films that would have expanded the tonal range of Star Wars and attracted top-tier directorial talent. The Obi-Wan film and the Boba Fett film promised a level of creative ambition and maturity the franchise desperately needed. Instead, these projects were deemed too risky or too dark for the mainstream brand. They were retooled into streaming content designed to fill a programming quota, losing their unique identity and artistic potential in the process. This demonstrates a fundamental lack of courage. Lucasfilm is no longer willing to make bold, singular cinematic statements. It prefers the safety of episodic television that follows a predictable, market-tested formula, even when that formula betrays the essence of the characters it seeks to portray. The result is a franchise that feels smaller, safer, and utterly devoid of directorial vision. The graveyard of cancelled Star Wars films is a testament to a profoundly broken development process. The list of abandoned projects is staggering in its scope. Rian Johnson was announced to develop a new trilogy, which quietly vanished. D.B. Weiss and David Benioff were set to create a series of films, only for their project to be cancelled. Patty Jenkins's Rogue Squadron was indefinitely delayed after extensive publicity. Kevin Feige, the architect of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, was developing a film that now appears dormant. Taika Waititi, fresh off an Oscar win, has seen his project stall in development hell. This pattern is not a coincidence. It is the symptom of a deep-seated institutional dysfunction. Lucasfilm has become a place where major creative talents are welcomed with great publicity, but their visions are ultimately stifled by a paralyzing fear of deviation from an ill-defined canonical and tonal orthodoxy. The root cause of this fiasco is a fundamental lack of trust between the studio and its creatives. Lucasfilm has developed a pattern of hiring established top talent directors and writers, only to subject them to a development process that strips away their unique voice. The studio seems to operate in constant fear of any material that is too dark, too complex, or too challenging for a perceived mainstream audience. Projects are reportedly scrapped over canonical concerns, or for being deemed too bleak. This reveals a critical misunderstanding of what makes for compelling storytelling. Great stories often require darkness and moral ambiguity to make the light truly shine. By demanding that all stories conform to a narrow, safe, and often juvenile tone, Lucasfilm ensures that nothing truly innovative or emotionally resonant can ever be produced. The creatives are hired for their names and their reputations, but are not trusted to actually create. This environment has led to public expressions of frustration, most notably from Lucasfilm president Kathleen Kennedy, who has lamented the troubling and frustrating scrutiny the studio's development slate faces. However, this misplaces the blame. The scrutiny is a symptom, not the cause. The cause is the studio's own demonstrated inability to shepherd a project from announcement to completion. The constant churn of announcements and cancellations has destroyed Lucasfilm's credibility with both the audience and the creative community. Why should fans get excited for a new film when the track record suggests it will never happen? Why should a top-tier director sign on to a Star Wars project when the history is one of creative compromise and public failure? The development fiasco is a self-inflicted wound. It proves that Lucasfilm, in its current state, is incapable of managing a coherent feature film strategy. The trust is gone, and without it, the future of Star Wars on the big screen remains a distant, uncertain promise. The tenure of Kathleen Kennedy as president of Lucasfilm presents a complex paradox. She is, without question, one of the most successful producers in cinematic history. Her filmography is a catalog of iconic blockbusters, and her skill in managing the logistics of massive productions is undeniable. However, the role required at Lucasfilm is not just a master producer. It is a chief storyteller, a visionary who can chart a cohesive, compelling course for a vast narrative universe for a decade or more. In this critical capacity, her leadership has been a failure. Under her watch, the sequel trilogy was launched without a unified plan, leading to a fractured and disappointing conclusion. The feature film slate has collapsed into a graveyard of canceled projects. The brand's health has deteriorated amidst fan division and creative exhaustion. A producer ensures that films are made on time and on budget. A visionary ensures that the stories are worth telling. Lucasfilm has excelled at the former and catastrophically failed at the latter. The argument for a change in leadership is now undeniable. Lucasfilm requires a new kind of leader at its helm, one whose primary strength is creative architecture, not just logistical management. This individual must be capable of instilling a clear, unified, decade-long creative roadmap for the entire Star Wars galaxy. The model for this exists within Disney's own portfolio. Kevin Feige at Marvel Studios, for all its recent struggles, successfully orchestrated a decades-long narrative across dozens of films. He did this by having a master plan, a deep understanding of the source material, and a clear vision for the end goal. Lucasfilm has never had this under Disney. The Star Wars storytelling has been reactive, piecemeal, and driven by committee. A new leader must be empowered to make bold creative decisions, to define a new direction for the franchise, and to say no to projects that do not serve the long-term health of the narrative. This reorientation is the single most important step towards saving Star Wars. No amount of canonical resets or production reforms will matter if the executive strategy remains rudderless. The current leadership has proven it can manage a production, but it cannot define a vision. The new leadership must be the opposite. They must be a storyteller first and an executive second. Their primary job must be to answer the fundamental question, what is Star Wars about now? And then to build a coherent plan from that answer. They must empower creatives with trust, not constrain them with fear. They must be willing to make bold bets on new eras and new characters, moving the franchise beyond its nostalgic safety net. The future of the galaxy depends on a leader who can see beyond the next quarterly report and the next streaming series, and instead focus on building a legacy that will last for the next generation. That requires a visionary, and that necessitates a change. The current creative model at Lucasfilm is fundamentally broken, centered on a centralized authority that stifles innovation. The solution requires a radical decentralization of creative power. The proposal is to adopt a model that gives film directors and television showrunners genuine final creative authority over their specific projects. These auteurs would be hired for their distinct vision and storytelling voice. They would be given a clear framework, such as a specific era and a set of narrative boundaries, but within that sandbox, they would have the freedom to build their story without constant micromanagement. This is how great, distinctive films and shows are made. The director is the author of the film, the showrunner the architect of the series. By restoring this fundamental principle of authorship, Lucasfilm can attract top-tier talent who have been wary of the franchise's reputation for meddling. It would allow for a diversity of tones and styles, from gritty political thrillers to epic space operas, making the galaxy feel vast and varied again, rather than a homogeneous product from a single factory. A critical component of this decentralization must be the dismantling of the centralized Lucasfilm Story Group's power over creative decisions. Conceived as a guardian of canonical consistency, the Story Group has instead become a bottleneck for creativity and a source of narrative paralysis. Its perceived role has shifted from maintaining continuity to actively stifling ambitious or risk-taking visions that deviate from a narrow, self-defined orthodoxy. The Story Group has failed in its primary mission, as the current canon is a mess of contradictions and retcons. More damagingly, it has become a gatekeeper that prioritizes trivial canonical minutiae over compelling character arcs and thematic depth. The fear of making a mistake in the timeline has choked the life out of the storytelling. The power to say no has eclipsed the courage to say, what if? For the franchise to breathe, this bureaucratic layer must be reformed into a resource for creators, not a governing body over them. This new, decentralized model is the only way to break the cycle of creative exhaustion. The current system produces content that all feels the same, because it is all filtered through the same cautious, committee-based sensibility. It is why a James Mangold Western becomes a tame streaming series, and why a dark Obi-Wan character study is injected with cartoonish action. By empowering auteurs and dismantling the centralized power structure that stifles them, Lucasfilm can once again become a home for bold storytelling. Creatives would be entrusted with the stories they are hired to tell, accountable for their success or failure. This would depoliticize the development process, focusing it on the quality of the narrative rather than its adherence to a constantly shifting canonical dogma. The audience would feel the difference immediately. The stories would feel personal, passionate, and driven by a clear point of view, rather than feeling focus grouped and sanitized for mass consumption. It is a return to the auteur-driven spirit that created Star Wars in the first place. The strategic priority for Lucasfilm must be a dramatic and intentional slowdown of content output. The current model, designed to feed the insatiable demand of the Disney Plus streaming service, has severely damaged the brand through oversaturation. Star Wars has been transformed from a special event into a common commodity. The solution is a deliberate and public shift to a less is more philosophy. This means significantly reducing the number of live-action series greenlit each year. The goal should be to create anticipation, not fatigue. A single, highly polished series every 12 to 18 months would feel like an event. It would allow for more meticulous development, sharper writing, and more ambitious production design. This approach fights brand fatigue by making each story feel essential and unmissable, rather than just the next item on a content conveyor belt. The audience needs time to miss the galaxy far, far away. By creating scarcity, Lucasfilm can restore a sense of value and importance to its storytelling. The most critical component of this realignment is a renewed, unwavering commitment to the theatrical experience. Lucasfilm must pivot its primary focus away from streaming series and back to crafting fewer, higher budget, and culturally essential event films. The strategy should be to produce one major Star Wars film every 3 to 4 years. This extended time frame is not a sign of weakness, but of strength. It allows for years of careful development, script refinement, and pre-production, ensuring the film is as close to perfect as possible. It builds immense public anticipation, transforming a new Star Wars movie into a global cultural moment, akin to a royal wedding or the Olympics. These films must be distinct, standalone cinematic experiences, not mere extensions of television shows or setup for future series. They must feel big, important, and worthy of the big screen, recapturing the epic scale and emotional weight that has... This shift back to event cinema is the only way to rebuild the prestige of the Star Wars brand. Streaming content is inherently disposable, but a great film is forever. By focusing its best resources, its most visionary directors, and its most compelling stories on the theatrical experience, Lucasfilm can send a powerful message to the world. That message is that Star Wars is back, and it matters again. It declares that the franchise is once again confident in its storytelling, capable of creating films that are not just profitable, but culturally defining. This strategy would rejuvenate merchandising, reinvigorate fan passion, and attract top-tier talent who want to make movies, not television. It is a rejection of the diluted, content-driven model that has brought the franchise to its knees. The path forward is not through more, but through better. It is through making Star Wars feel like magic again, and magic cannot be mass-produced on a streaming assembly line. The most extreme, yet arguably necessary solution to the canonical paralysis is a full reset. This would involve declaring the entire current Disney canon from the sequel trilogy onward as non-canonical. It would be a tabula rasa, a clean slate, mirroring the transition from the expanded universe, now called Legends, to the new canon in 2014. The primary benefit of this nuclear option is immediate and profound. It would surgically remove the single greatest source of narrative conflict and fan division, the sequel trilogy, and its associated stories. This would instantly unburden the entire timeline. The story would no longer be trapped by the narrative dead end of the rise of Skywalker. Writers would be free to imagine a future for Luke Skywalker's Jedi Academy that does not end in catastrophic failure. They could explore a new republic that endures and evolves. The weight of the most controversial and poorly received stories would be lifted, allowing for a fresh start untainted by their baggage. It is a drastic measure, but it directly addresses the root of the infection. However, the cost of this approach would be immense and cannot be ignored. A full reset would create a new schism in the fandom, potentially as severe as the current one. It would invalidate the currently popular and generally well-received Mandoverse, the interconnected shows led by Dave Filoni. The adventures of Din Djarin and Grogu, the story of Ahsoka Tano, and the rebuilding of the New Republic in The Mandalorian would be cast into the same non-canonical limbo as the old Legends novels. This would be a brutal trade-off, sacrificing good and popular stories to erase the bad ones. Furthermore, it would be a public admission of total creative failure from Disney and Lucasfilm. It would confirm that the last decade of storytelling was a mistaken detour, a costly and embarrassing misstep that required erasure. The financial and reputational damage of such an admission would be significant, shaking investor and consumer confidence to its core. Ultimately, the full canon reset remains a viable, if terrifying, option. It is the strategic equivalent of amputating a gangrenous limb to save the patient's life. The current canon is sick, and the sickness is spreading, poisoning all attempts to move forward. While the cost of losing the Mandoverse is high, the cost of continuing with the sequel trilogy's shadow darkening every new story is even higher. It is a question of long-term survival versus short-term stability. A reset would be chaotic and painful, but it would also be cathartic. It would represent a definitive break from the failed strategies of the past and a bold commitment to a more coherent future. It is the ultimate gamble, betting that the promise of a unified and exciting new beginning is worth the price of destroying the fractured and disappointing present. A full canon reset is a drastic measure, but a more surgical and pragmatic solution exists. This is the targeted retcon, a soft reboot that formally partitions the timeline to salvage the valuable parts of the current era while nullifying the most damaging ones. The primary strategy would be to declare the events of the sequel trilogy as an alternate timeline, a potential future that was glimpsed but ultimately averted through the actions of characters in the Mandalorian era. This approach allows Lucasfilm to have its cake and eat it too. It preserves the entire popular and successful Mandoverse, the interconnected stories of The Mandalorian, The Book of Boba Fett, and Ahsoka. These shows, which exist in a narrative space between the original and sequel trilogies, would remain the official, primary timeline. The sequel trilogy would be recontextualized as a dark, branching path that was prevented from becoming reality. This strategy would involve specific, high-impact retcons designed to neutralize the narrative poison of the rise of Skywalker without a messy, full-scale deletion. The most important retcon would target the return of Emperor Palpatine. The story could establish that the Palpatine who returned was not the true Emperor, but a failed cloned abomination or a dark side entity mimicking him. Its existence a contingency plan that was ultimately thwarted. This single change would preserve the sanctity of Anakin Skywalker's sacrifice as the true destroyer of the Sith. Furthermore, the timeline partition would allow for the continued growth of Luke's Jedi Academy, now free from the predetermined fate of being destroyed by Ben Solo. The New Republic would not be doomed to failure. This approach surgically removes the most objectionable story elements, while protecting the narrative investments audiences have made in the streaming series. The ultimate goal of this soft reboot is to create a new, unburdened trunk for the franchise's future. The focus would immediately shift to non-sequel era films, such as James Mangold's Dawn of the Jedi and Dave Filoni's New Republic film. These projects would no longer be prequels leading to a disappointing destination. Instead, they would become the foundation of a new primary timeline, one that branches forward from the Mandalorian era into uncharted territory. This strategy is a masterstroke of narrative triage. It saves the patient by isolating the disease. It acknowledges the mistakes of the past without completely alienating the portion of the audience attached to the current canon. It provides a graceful exit from a narrative dead end and opens up a galaxy of new possibilities, all while protecting the one part of the modern Star Wars story that actually works. It is the most logical and least disruptive path to a healthier future. The concept of a multiverse, while a well-worn trope in other franchises, offers a third and truly radical path forward for Star Wars. It is a path that could finally depressurize the entire franchise and end the endless, draining debates over canon. The proposal is to formally adopt a structured Elseworlds or Star Wars Visions model for high-budget, live-action productions. This would not be a chaotic free-for-all, but a carefully managed system of parallel official timelines. The most logical and impactful branching point would be the victory at the Battle of Endor in Return of the Jedi. From this moment, two distinct, equally valid timelines would be established. One timeline would continue directly toward the events we know, leading to the sequel trilogy and the story of Rey Skywalker. The other timeline would diverge onto a new path, perhaps one where Luke Skywalker's Jedi Academy flourishes, where the New Republic consolidates its power, and where the story continues without the First Order or the return of Palpatine. This formal partition is a pragmatic admission of a fractured reality. It acknowledges that the fanbase is permanently divided and provides a dedicated, canonical space for each major segment, effectively ending the Civil War over a single, official history. This multiverse framework would become an incredibly powerful tool for attracting the top creative talent that has consistently fled the project. Many of the most interesting directors and writers are inherently hesitant to work within the suffocating constraints of a rigid, established timeline. They fear the creative stifling and the inevitable fan backlash over any perceived canonical misstep. By offering a formal sanctioned "what if," Lucasfilm can completely change this dynamic. It can empower auteurs to pitch and execute their most radical concepts without the immense burden of making them fit into a decades-old, continuity-heavy narrative. A visionary director could propose a full-length film exploring a galaxy where the Empire won at the Battle of Yavin. Another could craft a tragic miniseries about an Anakin Skywalker who never fell to the dark side yet still faced immense challenges. These stories could be told with complete creative freedom, as their impact on the primary sacred timeline would be precisely zero. This would transform Lucasfilm from a studio known for restriction into a celebrated playground for narrative innovation, enticing filmmakers who would otherwise never consider working on a franchise property. Ultimately, the formalization of a multiverse is the ultimate strategy for depressurizing the entire Star Wars development and consumption process. The immense, often toxic scrutiny on every single project, from its announcement to its release, stems from one simple fact. Every story is perceived as permanent, unchangeable canonical gospel. This high-stakes environment breeds fear at the studio level and fury within the audience. By introducing the clear concept of parallel timelines, Lucasfilm can immediately and dramatically lower these stakes. A story set in an alternate universe can be a bold, self-contained experiment. If it fails creatively or commercially, it can be quietly retired without causing any damage to the core narrative spine of the franchise. If it succeeds spectacularly, it can inspire new directions, introduce beloved new characters, and even influence the main timeline. This model fully embraces the vast, nearly infinite imaginative potential of the Star Wars galaxy. It rejects the idea that this universe must be restricted to a single, increasingly narrow, and contentious path. It is a bold declaration that there is not one true Star Wars story, but many, and that all of them can be valid, entertaining, and worthy of exploration. This philosophical shift is the key to unlocking genuine creativity and finally ending the endless, paralyzing debates that have crippled the brand for nearly a decade. The most effective long-term strategy for saving Star Wars is to make a clean and definitive break from the established Skywalker saga timeline. The franchise is currently trapped in a narrative prison of its own making, tethered emotionally and chronologically to the events of a single family. The solution is to commit fully and boldly to wholly new eras, specifically the ancient past or the deep future. This is not about creating another prequel that inevitably leads to a known destination. It is about building a new foundation in a time so distant that the names Skywalker and Palpatine are forgotten legends, if they are remembered at all. This severance is the only way to escape the gravitational pull of the existing story and its associated fan expectations, controversies, and creative limitations. A new era provides a true tabula rasa, a fresh start where the stakes can be redefined and the universe can feel vast, mysterious, and dangerous once more. The most obvious and fan-demanded setting for this new beginning is the Old Republic era. This period, familiar to many from the beloved Knights of the Old Republic video games, offers a canvas of epic scale and immense creative freedom. It is an age of galactic expansion, of a vast and powerful Jedi Order at its zenith, and of an equally formidable Sith Empire waging all-out war. This is not the diminished hidden Jedi of the prequels, nor the struggling remnants of the sequels. This is the Jedi as an immense army of knights, a true galactic power. The stories here can be grander, darker, and more morally complex, focusing on new philosophies of the Force and conflicts that dwarf the Rebel Empire's struggle. By setting stories centuries or even millennia before the Skywalkers, Lucasfilm can shed the baggage of the existing canon. The story is no longer constrained by the need to connect to Tatooine, the Millennium Falcon, or any familiar iconography. It is a chance to build a new mythology from the ground up. The alternative, equally compelling direction is a leap into the deep, post-conflict future. Imagine a galaxy thousands of years after the rise and fall of the New Republic, the Empire, and even the memory of the First Order. What would the galaxy become? Perhaps the Jedi and Sith are both extinct. their teachings distorted into new religions and forced traditions. Maybe the galaxy has been united under a single, seemingly peaceful government that hides a dark secret. This setting allows for the ultimate reinvention of the franchise's core concepts. The Force can be rediscovered. Starship design, technology, and fashion can evolve into something entirely new. This approach is the ultimate declaration that Star Wars is bigger than one family, one war, or one era. It is a galaxy, with a history long enough to contain countless rises and falls. By committing to either the ancient past or the far future, Lucasfilm can finally silence the arguments about the past and build a future worth arguing for. It is the only way to ensure the galaxy far, far away has a future that is truly limitless. The success of Andor stands as a powerful testament to the untapped potential within the Star Wars universe. That series was a revelation not because of its connection to a beloved character or its abundance of lightsaber duels, but for the exact opposite reason. It was a critically acclaimed prestige political thriller that just happened to be set in the Star Wars galaxy. It proved that the audience craves more than a repetitive recycling of the same space opera tropes. The show focused on gritty realism, complex character motivations, and the slow, painful birth of a rebellion from the ground up. It was a story about espionage, bureaucratic tyranny, and ideological conviction. The Force was a distant myth, and the spectacle was derived from tense dialogue and moral compromises, not from laser blasts. The immense praise for Andor is a clear signal from the audience. They are hungry for stories that respect their intelligence and that explore the vast galaxy through different lenses, through different genres. Lucasfilm must learn this lesson and aggressively push the Star Wars IP into niche, prestige genres to avoid creative stagnation and attract new audiences. The space adventure formula has been exhausted for now. It is time to commission a Star Wars horror story, set on a remote world where a crew of explorers encounters a terrifying, ancient predator that is sensitive to the Force. It is time for a corporate espionage thriller set in the Canto Bight Casino City or the shipyards of Kuat. A story of greed and betrayal with no Jedi in sight. Imagine a courtroom drama set on Coruscant, following a public defender navigating the corrupt wheels of imperial justice. These genre experiments would not replace the traditional adventures, but they would exist alongside them, creating a rich and diverse narrative ecosystem. This approach would attract writers and directors who specialize in these genres, bringing fresh perspectives and storytelling techniques to a franchise that desperately needs them. This strategy of genre innovation is the key to avoiding the repetitive tropes that have led to audience fatigue. When every story is a variation on a lone hero, a droid sidekick, and a quest against an evil empire, the universe feels small and predictable. By committing to genre films and series, Lucasfilm can make the galaxy feel immense and lived in again. A horror story reveals the dark, unknown corners of the universe. A political thriller reveals the intricate machinery of power. A heist film showcases the criminal underworld. Each successful genre piece would expand the definition of what a Star Wars story can be, attracting segments of the audience that have never been interested in traditional science fantasy. It is a sustainable model for growth, one that builds on the strength of the setting rather than the familiarity of the iconography. The future of Star Wars is not in doing the same thing again, but in proving that this galaxy can tell any kind of story, and tell it brilliantly. Lucasfilm possesses two of the most formidable technical assets in the entire entertainment industry: Industrial Light and Magic and Skywalker Sound. These are not merely support companies. They are legendary institutions that have defined the technical and aesthetic standards of modern blockbuster filmmaking. However, their potential is currently squandered, locked within the service of a single, struggling intellectual property. Their primary function is now to churn out visual and auditory effects for the next Star Wars or Marvel project. This is a profound waste of their innovative capacity. To restore Lucasfilm's creative vitality, a radical proposal must be considered. Lucasfilm should return to its roots by producing original, IP-free, mid-budget feature films. These would be standalone stories, completely unrelated to any existing franchise, created solely to showcase powerful storytelling. The model for this exists in the company's own history. Before the Disney acquisition, Lucasfilm occasionally produced such films, leveraging its technical prowess to bring unique visions to life. This strategy would have multiple profound benefits. First, it would serve as a research and development lab for new filmmaking technologies, pushing the boundaries for an original film rather than a formulaic franchise entry fosters genuine innovation. Second, it would attract a different caliber of director and writer, those with original ideas who are repelled by the constraints of franchise work. It would make Lucasfilm a destination for auteurs, not a prison for them. Third, it would provide a crucial creative outlet for the company's own executives and producers, allowing them to develop and hone their storytelling skills on original material. Skills that could then be reapplied to the Star Wars universe with renewed vigor and fresh perspective. This is not a distraction from the Star Wars problem, but a fundamental part of the solution. The creative exhaustion plaguing the franchise is a direct result of corporate and narrative incest. The company only talks to itself, only makes one kind of product, and only solves one kind of creative problem. This leads to stagnation. By forcing the organization to grapple with the challenges of original storytelling, from script development to marketing and unknown property, Lucasfilm would rebuild its creative muscles. The lessons learned, the techniques pioneered, and the talent discovered through making original films would inevitably bleed back into the Star Wars franchise, enriching it and preventing the repetitive, safe choices that have caused the current crisis. To save Star Wars, Lucasfilm must remember how to make something that is not Star Wars. It must become a studio again, not just a franchise manager. Producing original films is the path to rediscovering the creative courage that built the galaxy far, far away in the first place. The analysis presented in this essay leads to a single, inescapable conclusion. The current state of Lucasfilm and the Star Wars franchise is the direct result of a failed strategy, one that prioritizes short-term financial extraction over long-term brand health and creative integrity. The evidence is comprehensive and damning. From the narrative chaos of the sequel trilogy and the saturation of the streaming market to the catastrophic breakdown in fan relations and the alarming decline in merchandise sales, every metric points to a brand in severe distress. The root causes are a lack of visionary leadership, a paralyzing fear of creative risk, and a fundamental disrespect for the audience's intelligence and passion. The proposed solutions are radical because the situation demands nothing less. Tinkering at the edges will only slow the decline, not reverse it. The cost of inertia, of continuing on the present course, is the irreversible dilution of one of the most valuable and beloved storytelling properties in history. The synthesized strategic path forward requires a fundamental and simultaneous commitment to three core principles. First, new visionary leadership must be installed at Lucasfilm, leadership that operates as a chief storyteller with a decade-long plan, not as a reactive producer. This leader must be empowered to make bold decisions and to instill a cohesive creative vision across all projects. Second, the franchise must make a definitive commitment to a non-Skywalker era, whether through a soft reboot, a full reset, or a formal multiverse. This is the only way to escape the narrative prison of the sequel trilogy and the creative constraints of perpetual nostalgia. The stories of the future must be built on a new foundation, either in the ancient past of the Old Republic or the uncharted territory of the far future. Third, the production model must be radically reoriented to prioritize quality theatrical events over streaming volume. The brand must be rebuilt around the less is more philosophy, creating culturally essential cinematic events that feel special and unmissable, rather than common and disposable. The conclusion is stark. While the residual financial success of Star Wars remains evident, this is a fading echo of past glory. Continued creative inertia and brand dilution pose an existential threat to the IP's long-term cultural relevance, and by extension, its earning potential. A franchise cannot survive on nostalgia alone. It must constantly renew itself, offering new stories, new characters, and new reasons to care. The current path leads to a future where Star Wars is a museum piece, a relic remembered fondly, but no longer a living, breathing part of our cultural conversation. The alternative path, laid out in this analysis, is difficult and requires immense courage. It demands admitting past failures, making painful changes, and taking significant risks. But it is the only path that leads to a vibrant future. The choice is clear. Lucasfilm and Disney can choose managed decline, or they can choose a bold transformation. The fate of the galaxy far, far away hangs in the balance. After a thorough examination of the systemic failures within Lucasfilm, one must confront the most drastic of all potential solutions. The possibility that the Walt Disney Company, despite its massive investment, may no longer be the optimal custodian for the Star Wars galaxy. The hypothetical scenario of Disney divesting itself of Lucasfilm must be considered not as a failure, but as a strategic portfolio re-optimization. Disney could choose to retain the truly profitable and innovative technical arms, Industrial Light and Magic and Skywalker Sound, while selling the creative entity of Lucasfilm itself, along with the Star Wars and Indiana Jones intellectual properties. This would be a monumental decision, but one that acknowledges a fundamental corporate culture clash. The Disney model of brand management, content volume, and risk aversion appears intrinsically at odds with the auteur-driven, innovation-focused culture that originally gave birth to Star Wars. A sale would be the ultimate admission that some creative problems cannot be solved. Within a massive corporate bureaucracy, the landscape of potential buyers with the necessary capital and strategic ambition is limited but compelling. The most logical candidate is Apple. With its Apple TV Plus service struggling to achieve cultural ubiquity, the acquisition of a ready-made universe like Star Wars would be a transformative event. Apple's culture of design excellence, premium branding, and curated quality over quantity could be a perfect antidote to the saturation and fatigue of the Disney era. Another potential suitor is Amazon, which possesses immense financial resources and a proven desire to build massive, world-spanning fantasy series, as seen with its Lord of the Rings project. Amazon's infrastructure for global marketing and distribution is unparalleled. A third, though less likely candidate, would be a company like Sony, which could leverage the IP across its film, television, and gaming divisions in a more integrated way than Disney ever has. The impact of such a sale on the corporate culture of Lucasfilm would be profound and potentially regenerative. A new owner, particularly one like Apple, would almost certainly clear out the current leadership and instigate a complete creative overhaul. The pressure to constantly feed a streaming service with content would vanish, replaced by a mandate to restore prestige and value to the IP. The development slate would be wiped clean. The story group's power would be dismantled. The new owner would likely impose a multi-year moratorium on all new productions, allowing the audience to reset and building immense anticipation for a single, meticulously crafted return to the big screen. This would be the ultimate hard reboot, affecting not just the canon, but the very corporate soul of the company. Such a sale would be a traumatic event, a seismic shock to the industry. Yet for a franchise on the brink of creative bankruptcy, this ultimate reset may be the only thing powerful enough to break the cycle of failure. It would be a bet that the future of Star Wars lies not in more of the same, but in a complete and total transformation.